Well, I want to thank everyone for attending today. This is Washingtonian's fourth virtual town hall, where we invite experts who know about the banking system and financial reform here in the United States to illuminate our supporters about a particular issue. This time we have Morgan Fox speaking with us. Morgan Fox is the political director for NORML, which is one of the leading organizations advocating for the legalization for responsible marijuana use. He will present on the problems facing cannabis consumers, businesses, and financial institutions due to current federal policies and the future of the SAFE or SAFER Act in Congress, which deals with how the cannabis industry deals with the banking industry. So we're very excited to have you here, Morgan. Without further ado, you can go ahead and take it away. And I will remind everyone, as with all our guest speakers, this event will be later posted on our YouTube channel. So if you have someone else who's also interested in the issue, you'll have an opportunity to share it. So go ahead and take it away, Morgan.
Great. Thank you all very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Honestly, it's going to take me about 5 minutes to break down the history of cannabis banking, and then I'd really like to turn it into more of an organic conversation and take a bunch of your questions. Um, so, from the very beginning of cannabis businesses being started, when the very first states started legalizing medical cannabis, there was absolutely no banking options involved whatsoever. Everybody was primarily on a cash only basis. And we're also subject to federal raids and, et cetera. Um, Once we got to the point of 2009, when the Ogden memo was issued by the Department of Justice, basically saying that medical cannabis providers would no longer be uh, a primary subject of investigation or prosecution by the Department of Justice. This really opened things up and started allowing traditional underground suppliers, collectives, and whatnot that had existed in places like Washington State since '98 to really start professionalizing and start saying, hey, we don't have to operate on a cash only basis anymore. Let's start talking to banks and see if we can start getting checking accounts at the very least. See if we can start working with financial institutions to be able to become legitimate businesses that, in their eyes, they absolutely were, and in the eyes of advocates, they absolutely were. Um, Unfortunately, the financial institutions industry did not see it that way, largely because of risk aversion. Um, and this is something that actually continues to this day. Um, However, there were a number of financial institutions, primarily credit unions, starting in around 2009, that were willing to work with cannabis businesses, but it was a very, very small number. And a lot of other operators in this area that were legal under state law, but still quite illegal under federal law, were actively going after financial institutions to be able to provide them with general financial services that are available to any other industry, and were finding themselves coming up short. They were either shut out immediately, in some cases were actually reported to the federal government and federal law enforcement, and even some of the institutions that would take on these clients would very quickly toss them aside and shut down their accounts over just the very smallest of infractions, or if they discovered that they were a cannabis industry, because unfortunately some of these companies were uh, trying to hide exactly what they did or like obfuscate it because they were afraid of exactly that sort of treatment. And then once they were discovered to be operating in the cannabis space, they were dropped. Um, from the position of financial institutions, that's totally understandable because this is a seriously heavy risk area to operate in. Not to mention the fact that you have to file SARS on every single transaction. or at the very least at that time you did. Um, so from that point onward, businesses sometimes found good banks, sometimes found banks that would toss them after just a matter of months, um, and this is still going on today. Um, when FinCEN started reporting on the businesses that are working with or with cannabis businesses, I believe in 2013 or so, we started seeing exactly what kind of numbers we were looking at, and they're very, very small. Since then, FinCEN has been reporting quarterly on SARS reports for cannabis businesses, and those numbers have been going up and up and up because the risk aversion has been going down because of the steady change in state laws and signals from the federal government, both in Congress and various administrations, that uh, things are going to change when it comes to federal cannabis policy. Uh, we have seen very little change to this point in federal cannabis policy, but we have seen massive change in state level cannabis policy. And we have seen a significant jump in the number of financial institutions that are willing to work with cannabis businesses on a regular basis. I should note, however, that the FinCEN reports on the number of businesses that are working with the cannabis industry are a little bit unreliable because they're based on SARS reports. And when the SARS reports come out, they're not necessarily indicative of an ongoing relationship with a cannabis business. They're just indicative of a reporting of a relationship at one point with a cannabis business. So these figures are a little bit unreliable, but they have been steadily increasing. Unfortunately, uh, as of the latest FinCEN report, less than 10% of financial institutions in the United States are willing to work with or are working with cannabis businesses. Um, so moving on to the Safe Banking Act, which would ostensibly directly address that and provide air coverage for financial institutions that want to work with cannabis businesses and protect them from a lot of the risks that they assume are there, such as money laundering, um, et cetera. They have almost stopped reporting over the last 6 months, which is very interesting. But we have seen that along that reporting that more and more cannabis business or more and more financial institutions are willing to work with cannabis businesses. The problem is that the vast majority of them that are willing to work with cannabis businesses do so under very, very onerous conditions. I've heard, anecdotal data suggesting that some banks have been charging cannabis businesses $10,000 a month just to have a checking account. Um, and these can be removed immediately with no real prior cause. This is something that the entire industry has been dealing with. Just another anecdotal story. One of the longest lasting Northern California dispensaries that has been around forever, since even before legalization for adult use, way back in the medical days, has gone through 37 banks. And that is incredibly problematic for both businesses as well as consumers because these costs trickle down. Now, let's talk about safe banking. This bill, which would ostensibly protect cannabis or banks that are servicing the cannabis industry from overt prosecution and too much discrimination from Department of Treasury uh, has been introduced repeatedly since 2013. It passed the House in 2021 overwhelmingly with a bipartisan vote, um, but it did not go anywhere in the Senate. In 2023, again, this bill passed the House with an even broader margin and heavily bipartisan in 2023, And then in late 2023, it finally got a hearing in the Senate Banking Committee, and it passed 9-4. But it didn't go anywhere after that. And so now we're kind of stuck in limbo. Uh, just to lay out some of the problems that exist with cannabis businesses and some of the things that exist with cannabis consumers with lack of access to banking. So, um, in 2018 or 2019, we started seeing a massive amount of uh, burglaries and sometimes even strong arm, like daytime robberies of cannabis providers by people that knew that they had large amounts of cash on hand because they had lack of access to banking issues. Um, whether it was, at night through the back door or, through the front door in the middle of daytime where they're putting, seriously ill patients on the floor at gunpoint. Um, this is still continuing today because when you have a largely cash associated business, it's definitely going to become a target for crime. Um, the industry responded to this by uh, spending massive amounts of money that they really could not afford on private security, on building in massive safes on the premises. Um, but this is also something that has affected government regulators as well. Um, there was actually a great story in California, I believe in 2018, when the tax department in California was basically just said like we're not going to take any more tax money from cannabis businesses because they were delivering it all in cash, and they wanted these businesses wanted to be on the up and up when it came to the delivery of their cash, but because they had no bank accounts and because they had no ability to pay their taxes outside of straight cash, they were showing up at tax offices with duffel bags full of paper money, and the people that were working at these tax offices were like, "We're not prepared to take this. Like, this is going to make us a target." Um, this sort of stuff trickles down even down to employees, where people are targets of crime on their way home from work. They are not able to necessarily justify their income, so it makes it difficult for them to get home loans. It makes it difficult for them to obtain apartments. Uh, so the lack of banking in this issue is not just about businesses; it's about like individuals. Um, at the moment, despite the fact that we did make some progress in 2023, there has been very, very little progress in Congress at changing the banking laws in order to protect financial institutions since then. And I can tell you that right now, it is a relatively low priority, despite what some lawmakers might say to reporters that are asking them about it. When it comes down to what's going on behind the scenes, in Congress right now, everything is about appropriations, and there are some interesting things going on regarding cannabis about that, but not necessarily things that are directly involving financial institutions. But I feel that the banking legislation is going to be quite a long way off, or at the very least, being pushed back several months. Um, all that aside, I think that there is definitely positive momentum within the current administration, especially being, very pro-business, and with the president being in favor of rescheduling, which doesn't necessarily impact banking whatsoever. Um, this is actually a little bit of an aside, but even if we pass safe banking, the major international banking institutions are not going to touch cannabis until it's descheduled. Rescheduling will not do anything for their risk assessment profile. Um, Descheduling definitely will. Uh, but in the meantime, it will help a lot of the risk assessments for state banks, for community banks, for uh, uh, credit unions. And I think that if we make any sort of federal progress whatsoever, we will start to see, especially within the form of safer banking, we will start to see a lot of smaller financial institutions jumping into the fold to take advantage of this opportunity and start developing relationships with cannabis businesses, whereas larger institutions are not going to touch it until we have complete legalization at the federal level. Um, that's kind of at least a nutshell history. I mean, I didn't want to get too into the weeds on a lot of the details on it, but that is a like a broad overview. And I'd really like to just take all of your temperatures on where you feel about working with cannabis businesses, and then answer any questions you might have about where things are going at the federal level, as well as what sort of behaviors you're seeing among cannabis businesses at the state level, and what we're seeing with regulators at the state level as well.
So we will leave it open for questions. I'm just going to ask people if you do have a question to use the raise your hand feature in the React section, as I'll demonstrate, and I'll just call them as I see them. If you, for some reason, you can't use that or you're not able to speak because your microphone or having technical issues, I invite everyone to use the chat and I will read your question. And we do have one person already has put a question in the chat, Joel. He writes, we need Washington State bank funding for Pacific Northwest high-speed rail and affordable housing. Yeah, that's something we're fighting for. But we're also, one of the reasons we advocate for public banking is all to provide some relief to the cannabis industry here in the state. And I see Joseph, you have your hand up. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I know, uh, as you mentioned, cannabis businesses operating purely on cash is definitely a safety issue. I'm curious to know if anyone, well, if it's allowed, or if anyone has ever pursued creating a sort of re uh, refillable gift card or like digital card that they could hand the cashier cash, have like some sort of online app that then credits, and then they can use that as opposed to having to constantly carry cash on them at all times.
So I'm not a fintech expert, but I know for a fact that there have been dozens of attempts to get around these issues in a lot of different ways. Um, Most of them have been, I guess, successful for a little while and then turned out not to be. I can't speak to that specific one, but uh, in the absence of stronger federal guidance than what Treasury has given financial institutions so far, um, people have been getting creative. Um, Unfortunately, that has actually led to some bad actors getting into the space that have screwed a lot of people over. Um, but it has also led to, some larger institutions testing the waters a little bit and then drawing out once everybody. See, one of the things that is a big problem in cannabis banking is that as soon as the word gets out that your bank is willing to accept cannabis customers, they get inundated, and because of the SARS requirements, uh, that can sometimes create a serious drain on the financial institutions' resources. So what we see is that sometimes folks will say like, all right, we'll take a few customers, and then word gets out, everybody's hassling them, and then they just say, oh, it's not worth the trouble, and they will completely shut down any of their cannabis business.
And just to elaborate on the question, could you explain more in detail the SARS requirements, what they are and what they entail?
Well, so the Department of Justice issued guidance several times over the last decade, and it's kind of always been a little bit the same. But for the most part, uh, you have to file SAR for every transaction. Now, recently, that's not really the case, but it's a good way to be able to cover your ass. Um, because you don't want to be caught up with without having a like a SAR if it's for some reason your client happens to like turn from a good actor into a bad actor, etc. Um, so if you do not file a suspicious activity report for all of these because it's still illegal under federal law, even if they're an ongoing client, um, you could potentially open yourself up to things like money laundering. So just to cover your butt, it's a good idea to file those SARs, but that creates an incredible resource drain on the financial institution, which I think is why a lot of these financial institutions are charging just really exorbitant fees for even just having simple bank accounts with cannabis businesses that already have uh, like exorbitant tax rates, exorbitant regulatory fees. So it makes it much more difficult for them to be able to operate effectively and to be able to compete with the unregulated market.
Okay, thank you. And then, so we have the floor open for additional questions. And just what Micah put in the chat about STAR stand for Suspicious Activity Report. And I do see Kimberly. Kimberly, I see your hand up. You can go ahead. And then we have Rebecca in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Given the amount of money we're talking about here, I would think the states would be absolutely scrambling to have, banks accept cannabis customers. All the banks, I mean, all we hear about in the news is how the state has to cut budgets here and there because they don't have inadequate funds. And I would think the state treasury departments would be saying, hey, this is an incredible source of revenue. Why don't we start lobbying to have banks accept the cannabis industry? So uh, it's just a comment. Thank you.
Well, you raise a very good point. And the more access to banking services that cannabis businesses have um, at affordable rates, the more tax revenue they're going to be able to generate for the state. Unfortunately, there does seem to be a serious disconnect, and I think that banks oftentimes don't like to get told what to do by the state and vice versa. And cannabis businesses certainly don't want to be caught in between that. But it would definitely help cannabis businesses to have lower banking costs across the board because it would mean that they would have less overall costs. They would be able to better realize their sales costs, which directly contribute to state budgets. But this is a disconnect that state lawmakers have across the board. And this is something that we've actually seen nationally. So in sort of Republican-run states that have legalized cannabis, we see pushback on allowing access. In democratically led run states, we see lawmakers trying to treat cannabis consumers as ATMs and increase their tax rates. Um, in either case, having better access to banking for these businesses is going to alleviate some of those pressures.
And then I'm going to turn to the chat because there's quite a few comments. So Rebecca says, could you talk about your vision of how a Washington Public Bank could support our Washington State cannabis environment? I get, Morgan, I invite you to chime in, but I think this question may be more dedicated to a group. So one of the things that we're hoping to do with Washingtonians for Public Banking and establishing a public bank, which is a bank is controlled by the public rather than a private institution, is having it be molded to fit some of the needs that we see are being neglected to the state. So that can include investments in affordable housing or investments in clean energy, but we could design the bank in such a way that it could cater to the cannabis industry in our state and develop some of the mechanisms that they need to adequately provide banking services. As of now, there isn't really a credit union or a bank that is formed explicitly trying to cater to the industry. They more like have a few people who are clients, and then they run into those problems when it's very inefficient to carry on those clients, especially if they try to join up in mass. But through a public bank, we could plan it so that we could specifically cater to the industry to solve some of these issues. It wouldn't feel.
Well, I
Go
want to
ahead.
hear the comment from the poser first, but I will say that it, this is an issue that, or there's an idea that has been floated several times. I don't think it's ever come to fruition, but I think it's one that's very interesting to pursue because it eliminates some barriers between financial service providers and regulators so that they can more closely integrate with how they're working with cannabis businesses.
And then I have Micah in the chat. Micah, you wrote a lot of comments in chat. Are you able to
I
un
don't I don't need you to read them. I was just providing some context.
okay. Well, do you want to elaborate on them before we go to the next person?
No.
Okay. All right. So the next person we have is Ronnie.
Yes, you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Um, the thing that I've, of course, been interested in, and guess I'm going to talk about later to the group, is the cannabis industry. They have cash. And of course, what they need is some sort of checking account. The big holdup in getting a checking account is getting access to the Federal Reserve payment system. So the Fed limits who can get access to that. And they haven't been willing to let banks open accounts for cannabis industries because, again, the prohibition on marijuana. But technologically, lots of firms could provide this payment service. PayPal and Walmart, everybody has their own means of payment. If this could be set up and then get access to the Federal Reserve payment system, that would solve all the problems. It's really a payment system problem that the cannabis firms have. That's their main concern. And right now, banks have a monopoly on that. And the Fed is helping to protect that monopoly for banks, even though technologically we don't need the banks to do the payment services exclusively.
The biggest retailers in this country are not going, as well as the biggest banks in this country or internationally, are not going to touch cannabis unless it's descheduled, completely removed from the schedule of controlled substances. They're not even going to touch it if it's rescheduled to Schedule 3. It's just a risk assessment thing. I had a conversation with like they're exploring it. I had a conversation with a guy who is like ostensibly like the head of like exploratory cannabis policy with Bank of America, and he was like bragging about how like his bosses don't care if he smokes weed, and I'm like, well, your bank is still like dropping accounts of cannabis businesses left and right. So how do you square that? And the answer is that they're not going to square it until they are completely covered by the removal of cannabis from Schedule 1. So I think that this is because that's not going to happen for a while. I'm just going to say it right now. Descheduling is not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen next year. It could potentially happen sometime within the next 5 years, but I don't like to bust out the crystal ball. Politics is weird, especially up in DC. But at the end of the day, I think that the financial institutions that have the forward-thinking plans to work with these businesses and start developing relationships with them now are eventually going to be the ones that end up profiting the most from this and are also going to be in a position to help not only just the cannabis businesses, but help consumers and help like criminal and social justice.
Yeah. Just need to get Bank of America and all of them lobbying their members of Congress. So
Oh, they already are.
yeah,
But in large part, they're when they're doing so, they're doing so for like in some cases specific carve outs. But
mhm.
uh, from what I've seen up on the hill, um, it's really kind of an afterthought.
So Jamie Dimon's not going to come out for legalizing marijuana. Huh?
I mean, he may, but how much pressure is he actually going to
Yeah,
put other than
yeah,
like a blog post and some tweets?
yeah. Thanks.
Next person we have on the list, we do have Micah. You came back to us, so you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just so just a for further context, I'm a cannabis business owner here in Washington and have been since the beginning of adult use and have had a bank account with a credit union since 2014. So thanks to uh, our now governor, Bob Ferguson, then Attorney General, created a bunch of regulations and guidance for the state chartered banks to work with cannabis businesses. So we've had, in just a sort of contradiction to the previous guy's comments, we've had access to the banking system through that since 2014. The issue is that retail licensees don't have access to the commercial payment system, so the Visa MasterCard system that we use to sort of transact at the retail level, which is not the same thing as the interbank system that we do have access to. So we have access here in Washington to lines of credit for both real property and equipment, and pretty relatively normal banking services with our credit unions and our state banks. And so what the Safe Banking Act would do is introduce those same sorts of protections to nationally chartered banks so they could have the same sort of opportunity under an umbrella of protection at the federal level, so their banking charters wouldn't be at risk in the same way that the state chartered banks kind of are protected now uh, at the state level. And so it wouldn't necessarily create enough protections for the Visa MasterCard system to accept retail payments at the store level. That's sort of still up for debate whether that would occur with safe banking, but it is one of the stated goals of it. And so,
Right?
yeah, just to bring some clarity to it, we do have access to the banking system. The Federal Reserve is not preventing cannabis businesses from having accounts and paying payroll and doing that. There is a barrier from the retail payment system, and a lot of the barriers to credit creation at the bank level is more about the unreliability of the cannabis industry as an investment, uh, more than a technical inability to do so. Because we do have banks here in Washington that will do lending for all facets of the business. So just for
Yeah,
that context.
there's about 1,000 banks and credit unions in the United States that are willing to work with cannabis businesses, and a lot of them have had like uninterrupted service relationships with cannabis companies. Um, the problem is that it's always a little bit of a crapshoot, and anybody could get their accounts dropped at any time based on uh, the flimsiest of reasoning. But you're also absolutely right in that these traditionally tend to be smaller banks and smaller financial institutions. But when it comes to payment, especially when it comes to credit card payment, nobody in MasterCard and Visa is going to touch this until we have descheduling. And we actually saw very recently there was a like a legal case where I believe it was Ease was or some of their former executives were busted for uh, obfuscating the source of the transactions when they were doing business with credit card companies, and they're looking at like 20 years in jail because of it, and millions of dollars in fines for the company. But you're absolutely right. There are ways to get financial service coverage for your cannabis business, and if you can develop a good relationship with a financial institution, like more power to you, but it is far from the norm.
Yeah, I was just giving the lay of the land for Washington here.
Do you have any other questions? If not, Morgan, at one point I'm wondering if you could help illuminate, because it's kind of come up with comments from Micah and Ronnie kind of having a synthesis of their previous questions is, you know, I think a lot of people don't realize the difference between credit unions and commercial banks, small community banks, and how credit unions, their main federal agency, the uh, NCUA, has been a lot more amenable to working with cannabis than the Federal Reserve. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts of that. It could illuminate that on why credit unions have been, sort of the preferred institution for a lot of cannabis industries because of that.
That honestly is a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
Okay.
I apologize.
Okay.
Yeah,
Understood.
just most of that was a product of the state regulator for banking, which is the Department of Financial Institutions, DFI. And so the same guidance went out for commercial banks and credit unions at that time. It just happened that there was 3 or 4 credit unions that all kind of got right in, and we did have one commercial bank that's been in the mix since that time too. I think it was more just a product of the credit unions were just sort of more willing to kind of experiment, and they also, I think, maybe had a better relationship with DFI, and so got the guidance sort of more quickly and established themselves in the space. And there's a very limited amount of businesses in Washington that are licensed cannabis businesses, so the pool of available clients is relatively small. And so I think once there was kind of a few institutions that had most of the customers, it became less attractive for other institutions to get into the business because it did require like about minimum of 2 people that were like maybe 3/4 of their time dedicated to the sort of filings that Morgan was referring to earlier. So I think all of that together just sort of created the situation we're in, where we have 4 credit unions that do most of the business along with 2 commercial banks.
My understanding, too, and I don't want to take up if there's any other questions, is that nationally, credit unions to have taken the lead of this compared to community banks or other commercial banks, because the NCUA, the main federal regulatory agency that oversees credit unions, has had memos. Its board has released memos providing more guidance and more leeway for credit unions to kind of take that risk. So they feel a bit more secure because their leadership, unlike the Federal Reserve, it has just been more flexible on this issue. Um, so
And
that's
regardless of what the Federal Reserve says, like, Treasury top has been, I mean, not necessarily clear, but at the very least, a little bit understanding, which is a good sign. But their guidance is relatively unclear when you get down to the nitty gritty. And oftentimes, things that you think are going to be in total compliance with what like FinCEN and Treasury guidance are, might all of a sudden, depending on who is looking at your institution, says, "Oh no," and starts like initiating additional scrutiny on your institution, and nobody wants that because that's going to take up additional resources just to be able to uh, deal with that audit. So I can totally understand why people don't want to necessarily deal with that. But I do want to get into something else that we didn't really touch on earlier, which is that like simple banking services are one thing. Traditional lending is an entire other issue. Most small businesses in the cannabis space, outside of the big MSOs that have access to venture capital and angel investors, um, they don't have access to traditional lending. And that's one thing that is very, very hard to find across the board, even among businesses that are institutions that are willing to work with cannabis businesses. And that I think is going to be one of the primary benefits of passing safe banking is that the businesses that are work or the institutions that are willing to work with cannabis businesses just in simple transactions and bank accounts and things like that, but that are unwilling to work with them in terms of lending, uh, if that's passed, I think that that will actually open up a floodgate of small business traditional lending that will not only help a lot of these smaller operators survive, but will help create a much more equitable and competitive cannabis market across the board in every state.
And we do have about 15 minutes left, and the floor is open if anybody has any more comments and questions.
Hearing nothing, I would suggest that anybody that is in charge of a financial institution consider traditional lending to cannabis businesses, especially small ones. They really need it if they want to be competitive. It's not necessarily the greatest short-term investment, but it's a good long-term investment if you're willing to stick with it.
Not seeing any more. I am going to take the prerogative to ask you one more question, Morgan. Uh, do you have any thoughts on why the Safer Act has so, I guess, aggressively stalled, if I can kind of lean into an oxymoron, in the Senate compared to the House, where it seems to have had bipartisan support?
Anything involving cannabis is stalled at this point because there's so much other stuff going on right now. Um, we are getting traction in Congress on like veterans access. We're getting traction with potentially, you know, fingers crossed, uh, with preventing DHS from interfering with like interstate cannabis shipments, or not interstate, but intrastate cannabis shipments. Because I don't know if you guys have heard about this in New Mexico, um, and it seems solely focused on New Mexico right now. Um, Anybody going from the southern portion of the state gets hit by CBP uh, checkpoints and gets all their products seized. Drivers get arrested, cars get impounded. Um, this is solely focused on New Mexico right now, but it's definitely something that could potentially spread to other states depending on how CBP wants to roll. Um, Dealing with that in appropriations right now to try to prevent that. Um, but yeah, across the board, you know, support for cannabis policy reform, both among the American people and in Congress, is a mile wide and an inch deep. Even getting floor space for anything involving cannabis right now is an uphill battle. Um, my job is to make sure that those bills get across the board. I don't think that we're going to see anything involving like large scale banking or even descheduling done this year. We might see banking get introduced in this session, but I don't think that there's any chance that we're going to see any movement on it until possibly late next year. But that's just my reading the tea leaves. Uh, I could be totally wrong.
Do we have any other questions or comments for our speaker? All right, so not hearing one, I just want to thank you again for joining us to be part of our series. I want to thank everyone attending. And I just want to announce that if you are in the Pierce County area on August 18th, we will be having a presentation at 5:30 at the Pierce County Library on public banking. And then we're going to be at the Cascadia Cooperative Conference on August 25th and 26th. You can refer to our newsletter for details about that if you want to attend the event or if you want to sign up for the Cascadia Cooperative Conference. Again, I want to thank NORML and Morgan Fox for joining us. This presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel. So thank you again.
I would like to actually add one more point. A lot of the businesses that banks are working with right now are medical cannabis businesses primarily. And traditionally, at least since 2014, there has been language included in the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Bill that protects cannabis businesses and as well as state regulators and individual patients from prosecution by DOJ as long as everybody is in compliance with state law. Um, that language has always been included in the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations bills since 2014. This year, it was included in the base language as it has been for the last several years, but there was an additional addendum that creates an exemption to those protections for anybody participating in manufacturer sales within 1,000 feet of a school, university, playground, or uh, public housing unit. Now, this basically means that most medical cannabis businesses are going to be potentially subject to federal prosecution and double penalties if this is to pass. It's Section 531B. So I would recommend that anybody that cares about cannabis businesses that were developed during in states that did not include that 1,000 foot rule, which is the vast majority of them, uh, really reach out to me as well as reach out to their elected officials and tell them to strip this from the CJS appropriations bill because it will basically gut those protections that medical cannabis businesses have enjoyed for more than a decade.
Well, thank you. We'll definitely keep that on our radar and follow it along with other issues we have. Oh, we do have a comment, Kimberly, if you want to speak before we close up.
Yes. Morgan, do you have a bill number for that bill that includes that exemption?
I don't have the bill number in front of me, but it's the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Bill. But I
Okay.
do know the exact section. It's 531B.
Okay. Thank you.
That same bill also includes a complete proscription on any administrative expenditures on rescheduling cannabis. Now, that doesn't mean that it prevents rescheduling or descheduling, but it reserves that if it's passed, it reserves that ability solely to Congress, which I don't think the administration is going to be too happy about, but it's definitely something to watch out for, especially since we've heard that the potential DEA nominee Terrence Cole said that looking back at at restarting the rescheduling process that was shut down in January because of more or less illegal collusion between DEA and opponents of the proposed rule, got shut down and delayed. So, yeah, contact your members of Congress, people.
And do you know where our congressional delegation stands on all of the issues you've touched on?
The Washington delegation,
Yes.
uh, they all have slightly different opinions.
Okay.
And to be honest, I've been mostly focusing on the folks that are on the appropriations committee right now because standalone legislation is not moving in Congress at the moment. Everything is about spending.
Thank you.
Right, and thank you. Thank you for being our speaker for this virtual town hall. And thank everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Have a good evening.
Thank you.